Thanks to Abingdon Peace Group for sharing the organisation of this webinar with Salisbury CND. It's very nice to be working on this together. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Tom Unterrainer, who's the chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He also co-edits The Spokesman, which is the journal of the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation. And that features independent journalism on peace and nuclear disarmament, human rights and civil liberties, and contemporary politics. This webinar occurs at an unusual time in which a Hollywood blockbuster film has exposed many people to aspects of nuclear weapons that they may barely have considered before. And at the same time, we learn of plans to bring US nuclear weapons to the UK. We're told that CND will visit USAF Lakenheath on the 23rd to conduct a citizens' weapons inspection, and I'm sure we'll all follow that with great interest. Tom, we very much appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight. So without further ado, can I hand over to you for the talk?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Abingdon and Salisbury groups for inviting me along. It's always a real pleasure to be able to come and talk to members and supporters of CND wherever you are. And obviously Zoom has made this whole process a lot easier. Should you want to invite me to either Salisbury or Oxfordshire at any point in the near future, please do so. I have a car, I can drive, and I'd very much like to meet you in person at some point. I'm looking forward to seeing as many of you as possible at RAF Croughton on the 7th of October. So I'm going to talk to the title of this event, The Nuclear Nightmare from Oppenheimer to Lakenheath. And obviously I've got a lot to say about each of these things. If I happen to go on for too long, I've got prepared remarks, but feel free to shut me up when you think it's time for other people here to have a say. And it's great to see so many of you here this evening. Now, our basic starting point for everything we discuss and everything we think about as CND is the fact that the risk of nuclear use is posed more sharply now than at any time since the opening of the atomic age in 1945, and certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. During the second event, diplomacy, negotiation, and the intervention of international figures succeeded in averting the worst possible outcomes. In 2023, the Global South has spearheaded attempts to bring about a cessation of Russia's war in Ukraine and all of the threats and risks that poses. Efforts, though, at negotiation and diplomacy this time round not only seem to be absent from the agenda of our government and their allied governments, but as the record shows, I'm afraid, they've set themselves in opposition to all such efforts to date. And the peace movements internationally, and in this country of which CND is a part, are working to change this, not least by raising the questions and raising proposals around diplomacy and negotiation wherever the opportunity arises. So Christopher Nolan's film, Oppenheimer, which I'm sure many of you have seen, came to the screens in this period of acute nuclear tension. And part of the film's narrative relates to Oppenheimer's opposition. For those of you who will have seen the film, this will be familiar, but it relates to Oppenheimer's opposition to the development of the hydrogen bomb, in contrast to his commitment to developing and then using the atomic bomb. Nolan's rendering of this important aspect of the story moves from interactions between Oppenheimer and Edward Teller, the major proponent of the hydrogen bomb, to stark contrasts between the two personalities. So if you think back, for those of you who have seen the film, the scene which covers the Trinity test, the first test of an atomic bomb, shows Oppenheimer up close and bunkered down to this first detonation of the atomic bomb. We see him peeking through a small viewing apparatus from his underground bunker, and our ears are engulfed with the murderous rumble of the detonation. I found the experience very disturbing of this scene, both mentally and physically. Mentally, because I knew what this test symbolized, but physically as well in the context of a cinema, because of the sheer wall of noise and rumble that came at you in the audience. You know, the volume and the intensity of that sound was something else in a cinema setting. In contrast to Oppenheimer's experience of this test, we have the example of Teller, who views the detonation from a safe distance. He sits in a deck chair, you might remember the scene, sun lotion slathered over his face and dark glasses in place. The two experiences are starkly different, in my view, and speak to starkly different attitudes towards what have been created. Teller, for his part, dreamed of ever greater destructive power. Oppenheimer imagined that the atomic bomb would open the way to peace and the end of all wars, not just the Second World War. In chapter 5 of his book, Has Man a Future, Bertrand Russell writes of scientists and the H-bomb. And he notes of Oppenheimer, and to quote, "When the American government first proposed to set to work constructing the H-bomb, Oppenheimer, who'd been the main agent in the construction of the A-bomb, opposed the new project. The authorities were outraged. There are those who may think that there was an inconsistency in being willing to make the A-bomb, but unwilling to make the H-bomb. The A-bomb was made in a time of war when it was supposed, mistakenly, though with good reason, that Hitler was on the verge of discovering how to make it. The making of the H-bomb was undertaken in a time of peace, when it was certain that if the project were to succeed, were to be proceeded with, the USSR would have it about as soon as the United States, and that it could not be a means of victory to either side." That was Russell. Unlike the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb has not been detonated in wartime, which importantly is not the same as claiming that it has never been used. One of Daniel Ellsberg's signal essays, A Call to Mutiny, first published in the early 1980s and reproduced in the new edition of The Spokesman, which I edit, which is called Oppenheimer in Mind, relays this fact in some detail. What do we mean by the use of these weapons? Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb and the consequences of his admirable, in this instance, actions resonate with another scene in the film where, just before he is to meet President Truman, and this is people will remember the "don't bring this crybaby in here again," that's what Truman is reported and almost certainly said, Oppenheimer is accosted in the lobby of a hotel by a character called Leo Szilard. Now, one of the things about the Oppenheimer film is that there's an enormous ensemble cast of characters. And the person I went to see Oppenheimer with, without the same sort of interest or deep interest in the history of the story, was a bit bamboozled by all these characters turning up. And I think the Szilard scene in the hotel lobby is incredibly important, but would have been missed by a lot of people. Szilard accosts Oppenheimer for a particular purpose. Now, Szilard is very interesting in and of himself, because he is the person who conceived in 1933 of the nuclear chain reaction. He is the person who assisted Einstein in writing the famous 1939 letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt that kickstarted the Manhattan Project that Oppenheimer went on to run. And it's worth knowing also, in relation to this famous letter from Einstein to Roosevelt, that Edward Teller had a hand in writing this letter also. So as it's known, the Einstein-Szilard letter suggested the possibility of constructing an atomic bomb and indicated that Nazi Germany was already working on such a device. Fast forward 6 years, and Nazi Germany is defeated, and there are no Nazi atomic bombs in evidence. In this circumstance, what could Szilard do but attempt to take action against the monster that he helped to produce? Szilard accosting Oppenheimer in the film only hints at the lengths that the former went to in order to prevent the use of the atomic bomb. Together with other atomic scientists, Szilard petitioned Truman to commit to not bombing Japan, something that Oppenheimer supported. The petition was ignored, and Szilard spent the remainder of his life engaged in action against nuclear weapons. Quite how and why Szilard and others drew different conclusions to Oppenheimer over the atomic bomb, I think, is a matter of psychological speculation. But whatever the differences on this question, both were haunted, Oppenheimer, Szilard and others, they were haunted, in contrast to Teller, haunted by the knowledge of what they unleashed. And Szilard's succession of short stories, including My Trial as a War Criminal, and similar stories, demonstrate the depth of his feeling on this matter. It's worth reading My Trial as a War Criminal, which is available to read online from Szilard, just to get a measure of quite how deeply he felt. But if we think about the different reactions and views and actions of Teller, Oppenheimer and Szilard in the specific circumstances of 1945, and let's think about how they relate to now. Might Edward Teller in 1945, and subsequently, it has to be said, might he represent that extreme section of current opinion and influence that actively promotes the role of nuclear weapon developments, the threat of nuclear use, and the centrality of such threats to maintaining political and military dominance? Would the Oppenheimer of 1945 be a sensible analogy for those who recognize the threat posed by nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction to the future of humanity, but who imagine, for whatever combination of reasons, that they are in some way here and now essential for what is termed security, or as a deterrent to some sort of enemy? Might Szilard stand for those of us who see the heart of the matter and who take action against nuclear weapons and attempt to see our modern day Oppenheimers see sense? Or is it the case that the reality of the nuclear threat today and the world-ending consequences of nuclear war, in contrast to the detonation of 2 atomic bombs, which were certainly crimes against humanity in my view, and which demonstrated a murderous, destructive power, but could it be that the gulf between the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the implications of an all-out nuclear war today are so extreme that the examples of Teller, Oppenheimer and Szilard are inadequate for our purposes? And I think it might be speculated that of the 3 of those characters, Oppenheimer, Szilard and Teller, it was only Teller who could see in 1945 the shape of the future that he helped to create. He steered a steady course throughout all of these developments, the development of the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, the neutron bomb, of which he was a proponent, all of the developments throughout the 1980s, up until his death in 2003 at the age of 95. And I'm quite sure he was happy with the results of what he created. In the same way, the stark and evident risks of climate catastrophe pose existential threats. Today's sharp nuclear tensions and the consequences of nuclear use also pose existential threats of a type probably unimaginable to Oppenheimer and Szilard in 1945, but probably imaginable to the likes of Edward Teller. In his recent work, this is a very interesting academic book that I've been slightly obsessing over for the past few weeks, but in a recent work, Human Extinction, A History of the Science and Ethics of Annihilation, Emil Torres charts the development of how thinkers understood the implications of the atomic bomb. He writes, there was, in the years following World War II, almost no explicit talk of what Russell would later in 1954 call universal death, i.e. total annihilation. But by 1961, Russell and others were writing about just these risks. And Russell wrote on the long-term conditions of human survival in his book, Has Man a Future? He argued that we cannot uninvent nuclear weapons, but the risks of such weaponry and the innovations that modern science make possible, such as the invention of a doomsday machine that could kill all life within days, the prospect of all-out nuclear war using hydrogen bombs, that these prospects necessitate decisive action on a world scale to put such weapons out of use, effective abolition. And you can see resonances with this viewpoint from 1961 in the efforts of the non-nuclear world to put forward and to gain support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And in the same way that climate activists understand the need for such global action and link their efforts at direct action to this goal, anti-nuclear activists, we need to begin to do the same, to link local actions with a global picture and to make very clear what is at stake. And only a widespread combination of people, groups, and movements can link global concerns to local action and vice versa. So this sort of action very much needs to be back on the agenda. And the situation could not be more pressing. I'll try and speed up slightly. I haven't got much more to say. Okay, but we're on to Lakenheath now. So evidence is mounting that the US plans to station nuclear bombs in the UK once more. Documents analysed by the Federation of American Scientists, a US-based organisation, note plans for the construction of something called a surety dormitory at the Lakenheath Air Base. According to the FAS, such a dormitory and surety is a term commonly used within the US Department of Defense and Department of Energy to refer to the capability to keep nuclear weapons safe, secure, and under control. Now, this latest news follows information obtained by Christiansen and others last year, which showed the inclusion of the UK on a list of US nuclear storage sites in Europe. And this list was connected to funding proposals to upgrade and improve nuclear storage facilities. So there's lots of kind of bits of evidence from official documentation which strongly suggest that the US plans to return nuclear weapons to Lakenheath again. But to my mind, perhaps the clearest evidence that the US intends to return nuclear bombs to Lakenheath is the fact that they've already stationed 2 squadrons of a new aircraft called the F-35A at that base. Yeah. Now, these aircraft, the F-35A, were designed specifically for no other purpose, but were designed specifically to carry a new range of nuclear bombs, the so-called B-61-12s. I mean, if this is the case, if those planes are already stationed there, and if they were designed specifically to carry this new range of nuclear bombs, isn't it just obvious that the US intends to bring these bombs to the UK again? The arrival of the planes was heralded in public, but if any questions are asked about the presence of, or likely future presence of US nuclear bombs, we are told we can no longer, we can neither confirm nor deny any plans or any information about the presence of nuclear weapons in this country. So it seems a bit bizarre to me, but it's very, very good. But it does seem a bit bizarre to me that the British media has finally recognised what is going on the basis of these dormitories and the use of the word surety. That they've finally taken note of these developments. So not every media outlet who has covered these developments has voiced opposition, obviously, but a recent YouGov survey by that polling agency recorded that of those questioned, a total of 7% strongly support the plans to bring US nuclear bombs back to the United Kingdom. 16% expressed some support. 59% opposed such measures. And this is a clear indication for CND and for anti-nuclear campaigners that a representative sample of the British population, a majority opposed the returning of US nuclear bombs to Lakenheath. And this level of opposition should be encouraged further, and more vigorous process action should be possible on this basis. So when you are leafleting on the streets, when you are talking to the public about this, bear in mind that polling shows that the majority of people are with us on this question. They see the craziness of this proposal. They see the threats and the dangers of returning US bombs to this country. But what do the politicians have to say about these developments? Very little. And this should be surprising, really, because we're supposed to live in a democracy. We're supposed to have democratically elected representatives to represent our interests and to speak for us in Parliament. But the fact of the matter is that not only is this majority opposition to the stationing of US bombs not represented in any way, shape, or form by what is happening in the current British Parliament, but there has been no deliberation, no consultation, no debate, no room for dissent over these proposals in any way, shape, or form. Okay. And part of the explanation is that what the nuclear armed states call their posture relies heavily on keeping the enemy guessing, on maintaining a degree of uncertainty or opacity. Now, the British government's own documentation, the integrated review, which appeared under Boris Johnson, which was updated recently, makes this clear. We're going to keep things opaque. We're going to keep people guessing. And this has been the story all along. And such a posture might make sense in a game of cards or, I don't know, Monopoly or something like that. But it seems particularly foolish with respect to nuclear weapons, when any wrong guess could lead to the extermination of life on planet Earth. I've got quite a few more notes to say, but I'm going to skip a bit and say this. Even without the massively increased nuclear tensions that I mentioned at the start, stationing such nuclear weapons in Britain again would be a deadly risk and would be something that we would vigorously and seriously oppose, because we know that even in the most stable of times, increasing the global nuclear bootprint creates instability. It encourages reaction. It encourages escalation. And we're seeing some signals of that already. And we all know that we're not living through particularly stable times. We know that every new nuclear development brings with it new risks, new dangers, and new threats in the local, regional, national, and international contexts, which is why CND has a day of action, a National Day of Action this Saturday, and why some of us, and we can discuss this a bit more in discussion, will be at Lakenheath on Saturday attempting a citizens' weapons inspection in an attempt to get to the truth of the matter. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And are you happy to take questions now, Tom?
Absolutely, yes. I think I've said enough, so let's have other people saying things. Yeah, so if I take a few at a time and then I can come back after a bit, yeah? Perhaps
yes. Why don't people just raise their hand visually if they want to? I can see Anne Dodd has her hand, Lynette has her hand, and Peter has his hand. So let's start with Anne. Anne, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you, Tom, very much. I wondered whether, in terms of membership of CND, what effect the film Oppenheimer might have said. Have you, noticed an increase in membership, or just what has it had? What's your impression of the effect of the film in terms of CND membership?
Okay, thanks, Anne. Lynette, do you want to ask yours?
Yes. What can we do as individuals now at the moment about this? What does he suggest we do as individuals?
Okay, did you hear that, Tom? Yeah. What can we do as individuals? And Peter?
Thank you. Very interesting, Tom. Thank you for that. I just wanted to be absolutely sure that I was correct in this description of these new bombs. They are they not, first strike tactical nuclear weapons, which is a pretty shocking escalatory development, I feel, to have that sort of approach to the tactical nuclear weapons, horribly misnamed, but were dreamed up to envisage that they could actually be used in warfare. And it seems a shocking aspect of it to me that these highly destabilizing weapons are coming to the UK. So I'd just like, if you can just say whether that's true or not. And the other thing I was going to just mention was I did see that CND had a special offer for students at the moment for new members, and they were offering free membership. And I think that's something we'll try and push at our local actions. If we see anyone who could reasonably pass themselves off as students, we'll try and urge them to join. Thanks.
Shall I come back on some of those? Is that okay? So Anne, first of all, I mean, not everybody liked the film. Let's be clear. I mean, I really liked the film. I thought it was very sensitively done. I thought that it covered a lot of ground. I thought it did it sensitively and maturely. I don't agree with those who criticised it for not more explicitly showing the damage done by atomic weapons. I think that would have been gratuitous and very difficult. And I certainly think our Japanese friends would have found that quite difficult. But I think that the way in which the impact of the use of nuclear weapons following Oppenheimer's kind of proposals, and support for this, when he's in the lecture theatre, I think that was done as well as possible without tipping over into gratuity. But let's face it, the whole thing was gratuitous. It's absolutely disgusting, crime against humanity, unimaginably evil in my view. But this is a Hollywood film, right, which has told a whole story revolving around Oppenheimer. So there were different views in CND, I think, about the film, and that's fine, and that is healthy. One of the massive plus points of the film is that his timing, Nolan's timing, and his film company's timing. They didn't do any of this to help us, to help the anti-nuclear and peace movements, but it came at the right time in terms of you could begin to have discussions down the pub, right, or at the school gates or whatever about these issues, around popular culture in a way. And that has been absent for a very, very long time. And so CND has tried really hard to kind of, to the best of our abilities, to relate to that. And that ranges from, all of the social media things we have done to the production of Oppenheimer film-themed T-shirts, which have sold massively well. And there has been an uptick, an upsurge in membership also. But I think one of the, always the biggest question is, how do you relate, these cultural developments to a commitment to the sort of, or to the sort of commitment that everybody here has made, and when they made it for whatever reason in the past, how do you make that happen? And I think, that's still a work in progress, really. And the more activity we do, sort of around the things that we're doing at Lakenheath and the Days of Action, all of that taps in. But I think in general, the film was excellent, and I think it's provided a big opportunity. And and I think in a way, the media coverage that we've got around these Lakenheath developments over this weird surety dormitory, which is not the most exciting development, but I'm not sure that would have happened in the same way without the Oppenheimer film and the fact that they'd had all of that blanket coverage in the cultural sections of their papers, and without the fact that, you know, it had been an ongoing discussion at large in society. So certainly it's been to CND's benefit. And when Nolan was interviewed by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, you try and track down this interview, it's available online if you can. He's very explicit, you know, when did this project begin? You know, what started it? And he said, well, it was in the 1980s when I was a teenager, and the massive CND demonstrations were in the newspapers and on the television, and Greenham Common and other things. So this had been, you know, working away in his brain for the last 40 years. And, you know, I think we should be thankful for what he's done. Lynette, what can we do as individuals? Well, raise the alarm, you know, wherever you are, have those discussions, have those, you know, interactions with people about the issues, and explain the dangers as best you can. But, you know, even, you know, my member of parliament, who I would not describe as exactly friendly towards CND, has agreed to meet me to discuss Lakenheath. You know, I thought, well, I'll email them again and see if they will bite. And they have this time round. You know, they know who I am. They know what I'm going to say, but at least this time they've met me. And, you know, what will come from it, I don't know. I'll try my best to be polite and understanding of their lack of understanding and knowledge of the issues, but something might come of it. And I think, like, this whole question around the democracy of the Lakenheath issue should be a big one for politicians of all persuasions, really, because, you know, let's face it, we've heard a lot of things about control and sovereignty and stuff like that. Whatever you know, I have my own views on all of that sort of stuff, which I'm sure I share with many of you, but I won't make them explicit now. But given that that is part of the picture of the political narrative at the moment, you know, you put in front of politicians, you know, the bare facts about, you know, the lack of consultation, the lack of democracy around Lakenheath, then I think many more of them than is usual will kind of start to pay some attention to that. Not all of them, obviously, because, you know, a lot of them are awful, as we know, but more than otherwise. So raise the alarm, yes, have those conversations, yes, but there are other things you can do in terms of, you know, the political question and putting the point to politicians directly. I think Peter is right about the B6112. It's a first strike weapon, and the reasons for making that assertion and the reasons why this is so awful kind of are worth going over. The B6112 has a number of capabilities. So this is the new generation of bomb, which we think is almost certain to be stationed at Lakenheath if it's not there already. Has a number of new developments. One of them is that it has a dialable yield. Now, what that means is that on the ground, they can choose how many people they're going to murder with these weapons. So they can dial it down quite low to some proportion, smaller proportion than the yield that was of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, up to several times that yield. So it's tactical in terms of, you know, they can choose a smaller, in their view, a smaller target to wipe off the face of the planet, or a larger target. So we're talking a battle group on the battlefield of tanks or whatever, up to a city that these bombs can destroy. It also has so it's a free fall gravity bomb in essence. So it's not a missile. It's not, you know, it's not a missile. It's free fall, but it has a tail fin, which is not fixed, but which is steerable, which means it can be targeted more accurately, you know, to a certain site. And it also, so we understand, has satellite guidance. So it's quite a accurate targeted bomb. but it's also launched from an aeroplane. Okay, an aeroplane which is based on land at a fixed point in the United Kingdom. And that makes Lakenheath, if it wasn't already, but that makes Lakenheath itself a target for any adversary, probably for a nuclear strike. So if the devices, if the aeroplanes and the bombs at Lakenheath were not used in a first strike, they would not be used at all, because that whole area would be obliterated fairly early on in any full exchange of nuclear weapons. So I'm not, my thing is getting rid of nuclear weapons. I'm not a technical expert on nuclear weapons technology, but if I've been able to work that out for myself, and certainly the Russians have, and they've already commented on it, and so would any other potential adversary, in inverted commas, in a nuclear exchange. But the last thing I'll comment on it in this situation, it goes back to the 1980s. The United States continues to conceive of mainland Europe as a potential nuclear battle space. Okay, so we're not even necessarily conceiving of an attack on the mainland territory of any adversary, to keep it as abstract as possible. But in US nuclear doctrine, and they've referred to this even fairly recently, both during the Trump administration years and subsequently, the term is nuclear battle space. Europe is considered to be such, which means that, who knows exactly what US nuclear planning says. I mean, we haven't had another leak of the sort that Daniel Ellsberg released recently, but it's entirely conceivable that there are US plans to drop nuclear weapons on wide swathes of Central Europe, Germany, so on and so forth. And this would be an obvious use for these F-35As and these B-61 trials. I almost feel a bit sick, going through all of these facts, but it's or these suggestions, but it's but it's important to get your head around exactly what these weapons imply and why they're stationing anywhere in Europe. And it won't just be Lakenheath that these bombs are stored. They will also be stored at sites in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, 2 places in Italy. I mean, they will be across Europe, and and therefore the risks that they represent are multiplied many times over, not just in terms of what's happening at Lakenheath.
Thank you very much, Tom.
But anyway, I started a bit more cheerfully with that response, and then I've gone not so cheerful again. But anyway, so let's go on.
We do have 2 questions in the chat now. I don't know whether you would like me to read them out or whether you'd like to read them out.
Let me have a look. So keeping yourselves updated. Will I send a recommended reading list? Cool to it. Yeah, I'd happily send some suggestions of things to read. There's an awful lot out there, I would say. I mean, I would still say that one of the best reference points is, is CND's social media channels and website. If people are not already in receipt of it, then there's a daily email from CND's press and publicity officer, which is a digest and links to all of the nuclear related stories that are in the national and international press every day. So an email to national office to ask for that, just in terms of keeping yourself updated on a daily basis for the issues. I mean, the Ellsberg piece is historic. It's nearly as old as I am. I was born in 1980. The article, I think, appeared in 1981. But the way it resonates, with our current risks and the level of detail that Dan Ellsberg manages to put in there is worth revisiting. So that's a call to mutiny, and I think it's fairly widely available. It's certainly available in the US edition of Protest and Survive. It was his introduction to that, but I think it's available out there on the internet to see as well. But I'll happily circulate other things that I think are worth reading, both about the general questions we faced and the current situation as it develops. But the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is obviously the other, and their social media channels is the other place to look for regular updates and information.
Thank you very much. So if you could send the names of the books you name checked to me, and then if people who want them have got the abingdonpeace@gmail.com email address, you could write in for them.
Okie doke.
Do we have other questions? Anyone wanting to put their hand up? Anything you've come across during the talk, or anything that came into your head before you came on tonight? Anne's got her hand up.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to ask any more questions? Yeah, Caroline's got her hand up. Have we got a third one? Well, let's have Anne's and Caroline's then.
Tom, you just mentioned now that you were born in 1980. Certainly I was around at that time as an adult, and others on the Zoom must have been as well. I'm just curious what brought you into activism on the nuclear issue. I mean, some of us are familiar with Greenham Common and the whole early 80s, which was when our peace group started, and it was a particular period. But you came after that, and I was just curious what were the influences that brought you in?
Caroline, do you want to ask your question? No?
Yes, sorry. I would like a little bit more detail and description of the citizens' inspection of the airbase and the weapons, and what you propose to do, and how you would think it would be worth trying to do that. I'm fascinated.
Okay. I'll answer Caroline, then I'll come to Anne, because Anne's question is probably more difficult than Caroline's. So, citizens' weapons inspection is quite a long-established sort of tactic, really, and it can take many forms. You can actually try to enter a site and inspect the bunkers, and people did do that throughout the 1980s. And certainly, in this country and across Europe, actually, they made their way onto sites and took photographs and inspected safety procedures and so on and so forth. That's rather more problematic in 2023, not in the UK, not least because of Suella Braverman's anti-protest laws, but also because there are much higher fences around such bases now, and many more guns involved. So what a citizen's inspection, as we will carry it out, involves is we've written to the person who is allegedly the commander of the Lakenheath base. So the Lakenheath base is full of American weaponry, full of American personnel. I believe it's almost exclusively used for American commanded operations, yet it's known as RAF Lakenheath, and there is an RAF commander of the site. So we've written to this person and outlined what we believe is happening at the base. And we have informed him that we intend to undertake a citizens' weapons inspection this coming Saturday. So there'll be a group of us and media will be there. We will have appropriate costumes for people who wish to inspect nuclear weapons facilities and other paraphernalia. We will attempt to approach the gate and ask as British citizens to be given permission to inspect the site and to ascertain whether or not there are nuclear weapons on there. So who knows what will happen? But certainly the media will be there and they will take some interest, I'm sure. How much further we get than that? Well, let's see. So it'll be what it'll be on the day. But I wouldn't expect us to get anywhere near the bunkers. I'll put it like that. But I think in terms of a way to highlight the issue and to also make the political point about the secrecy and the lack of transparency around what's happening at the base. So I think, I'm hoping it'll be an effective means of kind of highlighting our concerns again. So that's the current plan. Yes. I was born in 1980. How did I come into activism on the nuclear issue? Well, I mean, I've been involved in all sorts of things politically, both before and after, at the time I was at university and subsequently. I guess the big turning point for me was 2001, the 11th of September, and the subsequent wars and invasions and occupations that resulted. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, it was just, of course I didn't like nuclear weapons. Of course I thought they should be banned. Of course I thought they were disgusting. But it was, at that point, I'm talking 20 or more years ago, it wasn't kind of the central sort of concern. And I think that's because I was largely ignorant of what was going on. And I think in terms of kind of the overall kind of picture and developments, kind of they weren't central. I was far more concerned about the injustice and the illegality of the British and US government's actions. But I think back and look now, and I think things like Jeff Hume saying, when he was Minister of, Secretary of State for Defence, that he wouldn't rule out using nuclear weapons in Iraq. I mean, why didn't I take more notice of that at the time? Why wasn't that a much, much bigger thing? Here we have, a Secretary of State basically refusing to rule out unleashing mass murder on Ukraine off the back of an illegal war. I mean, this was bonkers. But weirdly, the thing that sort of triggered what has become kind of a central focus was the revelations of William McNeely. Do people recall that name?
No.
William McNeely was a submariner on a Trident nuclear armed submarine who had enough of the toilet roll catching on fire in the toilet on board the submarine, who'd had enough of the floods, the overflows, and the overall deadly dangerous conditions on board the submarines, and he blew the whistle and went on the run. When was this? This must have been 10 years ago, I think. And it was covered in quite a number of newspapers, but sort of, I suppose I had a bit of a Star Trek vision of nuclear weapons, like it would be the deck of the Enterprise, all firmly under control with sensible people in charge, all high tech and really safe. And of course, there could never be an accident and that sort of stuff. But William McNeely's revelations were really an eye-opener for me. And then, you look into what McNeely was saying, and then you start to dig a bit more about Trident. you know, and then you realise that it's not an independent nuclear weapon system, it's wholly dependent upon the United States. And then you think, well, this is a bit, and it grew from that. Yeah, which is why kind of I have a twin track thing of, you know, the moral outrage, but also the detail. I find equally kind of outrageous as well. So I'm probably not representative of like your average person who comes into anti-nuclear activism, because I was already in a position where, you know, I'd see something like the McNeely revelations and then dig into it, you know, and I'd already, you know, was anti-war and pro-peace, and was already kind of opposed to nuclear weapons. Yeah, but I'm not sure you can extrapolate from my experience to kind of the average person you might encounter on the street. But I do look at, you know, what we did around 2000, from 2001 to 2003 and onwards, and the sheer numbers of people we were able to organise and mobilise around the anti-war movement. And I look at all of the people I worked with, you know, 20 years ago, and think, where are they now? And why aren't they still doing things? You know, and so I think about what more could I have done to make sure that that whole generation of people who, you know, did some amazing things, and committed themselves for protracted periods of time to anti-war activity. What do they do? Well, lots of them have children, and lots of the people I knew got, you know, professional jobs. They had to be very serious, and then they got mortgages and stuff like that. But still, there's that thing in my mind of, you know, what did I do wrong? Why aren't you know, why haven't I got a gang of 20 people like I used to have 20 or more years ago that can, you know, cause havoc? So I think that, you know, we're all in similar, you know, whether you were in the 1980s or, you know, the early 2000s, it's a similar sort of story. But I just think that, you know, the level of determination and commitment we have, and the principled stand that we take, in terms of our opposition to nuclear weapons, kind of, you know, there will be more people who come along and develop that, and there will be opportunities for us to speak to a huge number of people about our issue. But we can't engineer the situation. You know, nobody in the 1980s in the anti-nuclear movement said to Reagan, "Can you do us a favor, Ronnie? Can you put nuclear weapons in, you know, nuclear missiles in at Greenham?" You know, that's not how it worked. He did it, and then there were people there ready to respond, and they built a movement, and they did it. You know, they reacted and organised and took a principled stand, and I think that's what we're ready to do again. But you know, there are, you know, the risks are very sharply posed. The danger is acute. There are things happening now, like Lakenheath, which we need to mobilise around and protest against. And you know, it's maximum effort really to make as much of the situation and as much of the opportunity for our own ends and our own cause as we can. And certainly that's what I'm trying to do, and CND as a whole is trying to do, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. One question, if I may ask one, Tom. It seems to me that the younger generation that have grown up since 2000, their big worry is the environment, and you know, the imminent danger from global warming and from the loss of species and all that sort of thing. And they don't worry in the same way that we did, who grew up under so-called nuclear threat in the 50s. For them, the existential worry is climate change. And I wondered, A, whether you agree with that, from having spoken, you've presumably spoken to a lot of young people. Do you ever get the feeling that they do get the nuclear threat, or is it our job to try to make the links between the nuclear threat and the climate?
I think there was a hand up on Philip Chesterton's screen. I don't think it was Philip. don't think it was. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Jenny, why don't you unmute and ask your question? She's trying.
Right, have I done it?
Yeah. Good.
Oh, thanks very much, Tom, for an excellent talk. Very informative. I would like to ask you what you how we can involve in this country the working people, particularly those who are involved in nuclear activities and work at Rolls-Royce and that sort of thing. And what is your comment on the recent TUC when the GMB voted to increase, for instance, arms to Ukraine? And they don't seem to be working for peace, in my opinion. How can we persuade the trade unions that this is of the utmost importance?
Right. Is there any other questions? Because we're getting quite close to 9 o'clock now. So, right, Chris has got his hand up. Chris, you can have the last question.
All right. What I was just thinking about, Sally, thanks, is the at Lakenheath, of course, it's the scene of two sort of near misses, two near disasters. I was just looking up on Wikipedia to see what dates they were. And in 1956, there was panic at the base. And apparently a lot of the American women and children were being driven out of the base because they thought it was there was a atomic bomb that was, I can't quite, I'm just trying to read this at the same time. And also in 1961, there was an incident. And I'm just wondering whether that is something that, you know, is worth bringing to light again in the campaign against more weapons, nuclear weapons being brought there.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks. I'll go to Sally's question first. I mean, the link between, you know, these questions is the phrase you use. They are existential risks, and I think some young people get it. And I think, you know, when you have the discussions and go through, there's a clear link. But one of the things I'm a mathematician. That's my background. Well, at least that's what I studied. And one of the most arresting things that I've come across and thought about is, you know, when people like the atomic scientists and those who set the hands of the doomsday clock, you know, obviously they do a long analysis and an integration of a variety of threats, nuclear, environmental, new technologies, so on and so forth. But they use the concept of, you know, the fact that an all-out nuclear war is a non-zero threat. Okay, so a very long time, for a very long time, certainly since, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even in the midst of a variety of nuclear incidents and accidents, you know, people would maintain that the risk of an all-out nuclear war was about zero. Okay, very, 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 very unlikely. And what people say now is that it, you know, the nuclear planners and those who look into it, is a non-zero event. And for me, you know, the idea that the complete annihilation of all life on this planet through voluntary human action, i.e. launching a nuclear war, is a non-zero event. Should be something that kind of is arresting for you. And especially for those who are concerned with, you know, human-made and human-induced climate change, who are very, very clear about, you know, the voluntary destruction, and that's what it is in a way, of the environment and ecosystems through production and human activity. But there are all sorts of other ways in which these issues are intertwined in terms of, you know, questions around what is produced and how it is produced. So there are, you know, questions around the green transition of industry, and this relates in some ways to Jenny's question. You know, there is the overarching concept of a just transition between production, you know, for military purposes or production for other destructive purposes, and production for human need. There are, one quite frustrating aspect of, certainly from an anti-nuclear point of view, is the idea that nuclear energy is in some way a green technology. So you will meet people, including young people, who think that nuclear power production plays a central role. But in a way, that's an opening, into the whole litany of disasters around nuclear weapons plants, nuclear testing, the ongoing legacies of harm that all of this that has gone along with all of this. So I think, that there are plenty of opportunities to link the two together, both in a practical conversational sense, but also there is a, just in terms of ideas, there's a, the two are inseparable. If you are concerned with the long-term survival of the vast majority of human life on this planet for the foreseeable future, then you should be as concerned about the risk of nuclear annihilation as you are about the risks posed by climate catastrophe. And the more we talk about that, the better. How do we involve working people in this question, particularly people who work in these industries? It's very difficult, incredibly difficult. I live not that far from Derby, where the huge Rolls-Royce plant is, where they make parts and components, not least the reactors for the Trident replacement system. It's a difficult discussion to have, especially in the current political and economic climate. What do you say to people who have highly skilled, highly technical jobs that get paid very handsomely? Do you say, tough, stop it, resign? Does the moral argument work? I mean, all of the kind of like moral urges that we might feel and ethical dilemmas we might feel about this stuff, it's quite difficult, where the alternative to working at Rolls-Royce and being involved in this sort of production is to get a job in Aldi. So it is incredibly difficult, but I think discussions can be had. I would say, well, and I know that there are people who work in such workplaces, not just at places like Rolls-Royce, but people who might work for BAE Systems and so on and so forth, who are fully aware of the moral dilemmas around what they're involved with. But again, the alternatives are very difficult indeed. And when these discussions, around arms conversion and alternative production were had in the past, I think people were always pretty clear that you couldn't really get very far with these discussions about alternative production or socially useful production and so on and so forth without a few things. One being kind of a general, political awareness of these issues. Two being trade union organisation, which developed over time a moral position on these questions. And so, for instance, in the past, the TNG were very good on this, sponsored conferences on alternative production, arms conversion, awarded a Frank Cousins Peace Prize, for goodness sake. But that's quite a far way from where we're at with Unite, for instance, at the moment, which TNG became. And the third thing you need is a government which will put its money where its mouth is. You cannot expect people, for instance, to look to a Tory government to think they're going to invest a lot of money in these conversion processes when they haven't even got an industrial plan, when they do everything they can to limit and undermine rights in the workplace, when they're happy to see people, when they're happy to see food banks proliferate to the same degree as they're, willing to see nuclear risks proliferate. I mean, you need a political governmental power which will put its money where its mouth is. And so, you know, there's only one part of that equation, really, or those three, that we can do something about at the minute, and that's, you know, a vibrant movement which says, you know, there are alternatives, which can put credible plans out there and which can have the discussions. And I think that's where we're at really at the moment. We find the people who might be in those workplaces or related to those workplaces who are thinking through the issues and have the discussions. And, you know, I think there are bigger hurdles for us to overcome. What do I think about the TUC motion? Well, I think it didn't address nuclear risks in any way, shape, or form. And therefore, I think that it was completely inadequate in that respect, and as well as in other respects. And sadly, it's not surprising that a motion that originated from the GMB failed to pick up on the nuclear risks in the way that it did. I could say more about the actual motion itself, but I won't say much in detail. One of the things I will say is that I thought it was internally contradictory, for instance. So on the one hand, it calls for a settlement by peaceful means. I agree with that. Yeah, to the situation in Russia, absolutely. That's centrally important. On the other hand, it makes claims for, you know, from a meeting of British trade unionists in Liverpool, you know, in there it says, you know, what bits of territory Ukraine and Russia are supposed to accept. Now, that's problematic for a whole number of reasons, not least of which is that everybody who's ever been involved in any negotiations in any way, shape, or form knows that you cannot have preconditions on negotiation and diplomacy. However illegal, and it certainly is illegal, Russia's invasion was, however murderous their actions have been, and certainly they have been murderous, however despicable the conduct of the war has been, and it certainly is despicable, if you're serious about peace and negotiation, you can't put conditions up front in the first place. And if you look at the efforts from leaders, you know, statespeople and others, and combinations of people from the global south, no such conditions have been put first and foremost, but they've put reducing nuclear risk there at the forefront. They've put saving Ukrainian lives at the forefront through a cessation of these actions, and they've put you know, global concerns up there as well. And I think, therefore, there are some lessons to learn there. It's worth noting also that the original GMB motion that went to the TUC was changed significantly in what's called the compositing process. So what was actually passed is nowhere near as explicit in terms of arms as the original GMB motion was. And also after the vote, the TUC itself issued statements, particularly about that question of territory and then the call for peace, to clarify that, you know, of course, we're not saying that this needs to be met before there could be peace talks. So I think there's more to this whole story than we might read in, you know, in the coverage in the Daily Telegraph that I saw, for instance. Chris. Oh, all I would say on the risks, and yes, there all sorts of terrible things have happened at Lakenheath in the past. But one thing I wanted to mention, and I'll probably close on this, just to cheer everybody up, is you will have seen stories about the missing F-35B in the United States, not the F-35A, but the F-35B. The F-35B, I believe, can be slightly adjusted so it can carry a nuclear payload. But the thing about it is that it's a stealth, supposedly they couldn't find it, so it's very stealthy. A stealth aircraft. But there was a problem. The pilot had to eject, and then they couldn't find it. Now, I don't know the precise details, but my guess would be that the difference between the F-35A in technical respects and the F-35B is not all that huge. So I would want to know, what went wrong? Could an F-35A with a nuclear payload disappear in the same way in deepest Cambridgeshire? It's almost farcical, isn't it? The whole thing, but it's also incredibly deadly and demonstrative of the real risks that are presented. So CND will be asking questions about the relationship between the F-35A and the F-35B. That wasn't the first F-35B that had such technical difficulties. So if you've got a situation where the pilot has to eject and the transponder's off, something quite significant has gone wrong. Okay, and similar quite significant things have gone wrong with these aircraft in the past. What were those things? Might the same thing occur with the 2 squadrons of F-35As that are already at Lakenheath? What are the risks? This is real stuff. Yeah. Now, the plane that went missing in the United States is it North Carolina? The southeast of England is an incredibly densely populated, area. Now, there aren't huge tracts of land for, these aircraft to crash in. Potentially deadly, potentially dangerous. Yes, and so CND is looking into it.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think we're going to have to let you get back to your baby now. We've gone over time already.
That was the 9-year-old moaning in the background. Did you hear
it? But thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I'm going to have to go and watch Oppenheimer again, I think, because you've pointed out bits that many of us might have missed the first time round. We really look forward to seeing you in your nuclear inspection suit on the social media. Or
I hope they've got me a large one. I need a.
And that's on October 7th. And this has been really good fun and interesting and inspiring as well. I think we're all going home thinking, right, we've got to, do a bit more about it.
We've got lots to do, but thank you.